the French philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal was born in 1623 and died in 1662, so he lived during the 17th century. And this was actually a time when there were many plagues, pestilences, and diseases going around. It wasn't uncommon to die from something like the plague or smallpox. And of course, back then, they didn't have the medical technology that we have today. So it really was quite painful and horrible to die. But despite the fact that death was such a common occurrence back then, people still rarely thought about what happens after we die. Pascal was one of the first people to ever contemplate what happens after we die, and he came up with some interesting ideas. In today's video, we're going to go over his famous Pascal's wager and why he believed that death is the greatest teacher. Let's begin. Blaise Pascal was a very smart man who made discoveries in mathematics and wrote philosophical works that are still read today. However, towards the end of his life, he had a profound religious experience which changed the direction of his writing. Before this experience, Pascal was an agnostic and even wrote a book called The Age of Reason, where he argued against the existence of God. But after his experience, he became a devout Christian. In his early 40s, Pascal developed a rare disease that caused excruciating pain in his abdomen, likely due to stomach cancer. This went on for several months, and he kept writing down his thoughts in a notebook while enduring these pains. He said things like, "I feel myself to be 1,000 deaths, and if I ever doubted, I now know that I am being consumed by the fire of the living God." After enduring this sickness for 7 months, he died on August 19, 1662, at the age of 39. Throughout Pascal's life, he struggled with his beliefs in God, but it wasn't until he was dying from a mysterious disease that he truly understood the nature of faith and death. And these ideas culminated into what is called Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is essentially the idea that if we don't know whether or not God exists, then we should simply bet that he does because the potential rewards outweigh the risks. Pascal says that if we bet that God doesn't exist and we're wrong, then we lose the opportunity to go to heaven. But if we bet that God does exist and we're wrong, then we don't really lose anything. We may just not go to heaven, but we also won't go to hell. Now, obviously, this is a very simplified explanation of Pascal's wager. And throughout history, many philosophers have criticized his reasoning, pointing out flaws in his logic. For example, if you argue that Pascal's wager makes sense, then someone could come along and say, "Well, what if you're the one who's wrong?" And then you would have to say, "Well, that's impossible, because God can't be wrong." And so, you see the problem here. Pascal's wager isn't logical, and it doesn't make sense. However, what we need to remember is that Pascal wasn't trying to create a foolproof argument for the existence of God. His whole life he struggled with believing in God, and all his writing was an attempt to work through his own problems with faith. Pascal's wager was never meant to convince atheists that God exists. It was only meant to convince Pascal himself. We also need to remember that Pascal experienced terrible pain throughout his last few months alive. And of course, this affected how he saw the world. As he was dying, he realized that death is inevitable. Once he accepted this, he was able to move forward in his spiritual journey. This is why we say that death is Pascal's greatest teacher. Through his sickness and eventual death, he learned what it means to be human. He learned that no matter how smart or talented you are, death is inevitable and will happen to you. And this realization allowed him to become a better philosopher and writer. So now, let's talk about how we can use Pascal's story to improve our own lives. First, we need to realize that death is inevitable. No matter how old you are or what you've accomplished in your life, one day you will die. The second thing we can learn from Pascal is that death is not something to be afraid of. Yes, it is uncomfortable to think about, but that doesn't mean we should avoid thinking about it. In fact, I believe that we should think about death as often as we can. That way we will always be prepared for it, and we won't be caught off guard. Also, by thinking about death, we can learn to appreciate life more. We can learn to take the good days and the bad days and be thankful for them. And finally, we need to remember that death is just a part of life. It's uncomfortable to think about, yes, but it's something that we need to accept. By accepting death, we can live our lives to the fullest and be more like Pascal. Now, some people might say that it's not normal to think about death all the time and that we shouldn't think about it too often. However, I disagree with this. I think that we should think about death as often as we can. One of my favorite quotes comes from the character Steve Jobs in the movie Jobs. When Steve Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, he told his family and friends that he wanted to die. He said, "I want to be able to put everything in perspective. I don't want to forget that I'm going to die. I don't want to forget that I'm going to die." And I love this quote because it shows that even one of the most successful businessmen of our generation realizes that death is inevitable and important. By thinking about death, we can learn to live our lives to the fullest. We can learn to take the good days and the bad days and be thankful for them. And we can learn to appreciate the people in our lives. Now, I know that this sounds depressing, but it's actually quite the opposite. By thinking about death, we can learn to live our lives to the fullest. We can learn to take the good days and the bad days and be thankful for them. And we can learn to appreciate the people in our lives. And finally, we need to remember that death is just a part of life. It's uncomfortable to think about, yes, but it's something that we need to accept. In conclusion, Pascal's wager is not a foolproof argument for the existence of God. It's a flawed argument with many holes in its logic. However, Pascal wasn't trying to make a perfect argument. He was trying to make sense of his own beliefs. And in doing so, he gave us an interesting way to think about death. Death is inevitable, so we might as well learn to accept it. By thinking about death often, we can learn to live our lives to the fullest. So let's all try to be more like Pascal and think about death often. And if you liked this video, check out this video right here. And don't forget to subscribe.